Hello and welcome to last section of this complete NgRx course for state management in Angular. In this section, we are going to learn all about NgRx data. And in this lecture, let's have a brief overview of what is NgRx data and why we would like to use NgRx data for state management in our Angular application. Remember that NgRx data is nothing but it is a part of NgRx ecosystem, and it is a library which is built on top of NgRx Store and NgRx Entity to simplify handling common CRUD operations. So a very important point here to understand is NgRx data is dependent on NgRx Store and NgRx Entity. Now, what does NgRx data does? Well, it provides a higher level of abstraction over NgRx Store. Basically, it reduces the boilerplate code which we write in order to update the state, and it also improves the developer productivity because when we use NgRx data, we as a developer will have to write very less code. What it does is it basically eliminates any boilerplate code which we write in order to make HTTP calls through NgRx effects and in order to update the state with the latest data using reducer functions. So at its core, NgRx data is about automating the repetitive pattern of state management for entities. So when we work with NgRx Store, there we have to write actions for loading, adding, updating, and deleting entities. We also need to write reducers, which is used for handling how these actions modify the state for each entity collection. We need to write effects, and as we know, effects is used for managing side effects like making HTTP requests to your API for each operation. Then we also need to write some selector functions to query specific data from the entity state. Then we also need to write services. Now, when we use NgRx data, we don't need to write effects in order to perform any HTTP call. We can also remove reducers in order to update the state in the store. And we also don't need to write any action to define the actions like loading, adding, updating, etc. And we can also eliminate the selectors. So when we use NgRx data, as I mentioned before, it reduces all the boilerplate codes which we need to write in order to make HTTP requests as well as in order to update the state in the store. So NgRx data abstracts away much of these repetitive works for us. You define your entities like the course entity or the product entity or the post entity, etc., and their metadata, and NgRx data automatically generates the necessary actions, reducers, effects, and even it provides services with pre-built methods for common CRUD operations. And this is the advantage which we get when we use NgRx data. So NgRx Store is powerful, but it can be verbose and repetitive when implementing standard entity operations like updating an entity, deleting an entity, creating an entity, and reading the entities. Because when we use only NgRx Store, there to perform each of these operations, we have to define actions, reducers, effects, etc. But NgRx data offers a convention over configuration approach, which means you write less code, you follow standardized patterns, and you get powerful reactive state management without hand coding actions, reducers, and effects for each entity. Now, NgRx data cannot be used in all the cases. We can use NgRx data when our application interacts heavily with REST APIs and when we want to manage multiple entity collections. Also, if we want to reduce boilerplate without sacrificing the benefits of Redux style state management, we can use NgRx data. So I hope you now already understand why we should use NgRx data for state management in our Angular application. But still, I want to show you some of the benefits which we get when we use NgRx data. So first of all, as we have learned, it eliminates the need to write repetitive actions, reducers, selectors, and effects for CRUD operations. And since we don't have to write all this, it improves the productivity of the developer. Then when we use NgRx data, it encourages convention over configuration. Basically, it enforces a consistent pattern for handling entity data across your application, which improves maintainability and makes it easier for new team members to understand the code base. Also, when we use NgRx data, it has built-in entity services. So basically, it provides ready-to-use methods for fetching data, for adding data, for updating data and deleting data. So we don't have to write the code for these operations manually. We can simply use the built-in methods to perform these operations. And NgRx data is well optimized for REST APIs. It works well with Angular's HTTP client, and it is also possible to customize the API behavior. Then, since we have to write less boilerplate code, it improves the developer's productivity. Also, when we use NgRx data, it is reactive and testable. And finally, NgRx data is extensible. So, NgRx data is highly extensible, allowing you to override default behaviors and inject custom logic whenever needed. So, in summary, NgRx data is a powerful tool for large-scale Angular applications that deals extensively with common entity data. It strikes a balance between the full control offered by Core NgRx and the need for rapid development and reduces boilerplate, especially for CRUD-heavy scenarios. Alright, so this was a very high level overview of what NgRx data is and why we might want to use it in our NgRx application. From the next lecture, we are going to understand NgRx data with practical implementation. But before that, we are going to do some cleanup in our project because as I mentioned, when we use NgRx data, we don't need to write reducers, effects, actions, etc. So for the CRUD operation which we are performing on our courses entity, we are going to remove the actions, reducers, effects and selectors that we will do in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. Thank you for listening and have a great day.